IMF mission to Zambia is likely to happen in the coming weeks, according to sources within the Southern African space. Still talking with the IMF, IMF says it's working urgently on financing deal and debt for the landlocked Malawi in Southern Africa. Mozambique has raised gasoline prices by 10.5%, and that's the impact of the high elevated price of crude oil, globally speaking. American Platinum, third quarter, on the South African exchange, reporting total platinum output up 1% to about 519,100 ounces in the third quarter period of July to September. And South Africa is planning $500 million in green investments, but that's just scratching the surface when you look at what South Africa needs to have to meet the energy transition requirements. And that's part of my conversation right now, because traders are holding bets that South Africa's central bank, that the SARB, will increase interest rates this year after inflation quickened to a 4-month high in September. And that's according to the South Africa's online business news platform, MoneyWeb. Forward rate agreements starting a month from now, which is used to speculate on borrowing costs in South Africa, are now fully pricing in a 25 basis point hike and a 64% chance that there'll be an increase at the next meeting of the SARB policy meeting, which will be November the 18th. Let's chat to this and the road ahead for South Africa's energy transition and what it means for business investment. Hart from Cape Town. Thank you so much for coming through, the Executive Chairman at Impact Investment Africa. Good evening. What is the outlook on South Africa's inflation, September at 5%? Are businesses and investors betting that high inflation is here to stay in your economy?
Very much so. I think the inflation is certainly on a cyclical upturn, and there may well be a structural shift in the inflation as well. The Reserve Bank is looking to anchor inflation towards the bottom of the inflation range, target range, which is 3 to 6%. In other words, I want to define that a little bit tighter. But the recent rise in inflation is something that is a concern, and that it may be more than cyclical. I think the rise in government expenditure and the pressure it's putting on the rand over the longer term may well see inflation rise to an uncomfortably higher level, maybe 6 to 7%, which would be very, very unfortunate at this stage, especially with the weakness of the economy. To be raising interest rates in the face of that would be an extremely difficult decision to actually to take at this stage.
Tell me about the conversations going on the ground in the business and investment sectors in South Africa regarding the financing of dirty energy such as coal.
Yeah, I think we are seeing some institutions saying that they're no longer going to finance coal investments. There are some institutions that still will. I think South Africa is still very dependent on coal. And there's an enormous reserve that South Africa still has in the ground. And clearly, if we don't use it, it'll become a stranded asset. And, but there are concerns over the actual carbon emissions at the same time. You contrast that, to say Germany, which has depleted their coal reserves and has a much more, and is a far wealthier economy. And they can have the luxury of saying, well, we're going to transition to green sources of energy because it's almost like they can and should. But South Africa, we probably need to use coal for some time. And the transition certainly doesn't need to be as urgent as countries that are depleting their coal reserves or certainly their best coal reserves already down. South Africa has always relied on cheap energy as a competitive advantage, but that has been whittled away over the last few years because of problems at Eskom that really were self-inflicted. But that has a knock-on effect in the industry, especially in the in sectors that need a lot of energy. Like metalwork and that type of thing. And we can see that in the actual industry, that even the radical unions of back down after what would be reflected as a normal. The opening bid for the recent wage negotiations in the metalworkers industry was 8%, which they never ever achieved, and that's a normal modest opening bid that they had. Because the sector is struggling, and it's struggling with competitiveness, and that comes from electricity prices that have been rising too much. So South Africa, in a sense, needs to determine how can they use coal as an anchor for cheap electricity, right? And at the same time also start on transitioning to less dependence on coal over the longer term.
Chris, how smooth do you think the transition would be for South Africa, a highly industrialized and advanced economy? Now the news is that about a $500 million green investment plan has been made, but that looks like just still scratching the surface. But do you think this is the best of intention that South Africa can put forward before the climate change, the COP26 conference, global summit starting in the next few days in Glasgow?
Yeah, I think in the South African economy, the biggest challenge of the South African economy is, in fact, unemployment. And the climate change is trying to solve a different problem. And South Africa has been cooperative with that different problem. But to start allocating resources, in the economic speak, is allocation of scarce resources. If you allocate more to the green energy, it's less to something else. And it's not necessarily conducive to actually creating jobs. And that's what really is what our priority should be. And I think while South Africa tries to cooperate with these climate accords, there should be reciprocity to say, while we're trying to solve, help with the global problem, we actually need to be helped with our unemployment problem. And that's where there needs to be a fairer exchange, which I don't think is properly on the table. South Africa cannot afford to have higher unemployment. It's really at crisis levels already. And the climate accords, especially with the energy mix that we've got, and the need to divert more resources to alternatives, with these agreements, we do need to actually do it. And again, if we take the first inflation outlook, if we start putting more and more alternatives, the energy costs will continue to rise, and South Africa's competitiveness will continue to fall. And that, again, is not going to be conducive to stabilizing and reducing the unemployment rate.
Okay, talk to me about business confidence in South Africa as we wind down the current year. How do you think is all going down right now with the climate issue we're talking about, inflation, unemployment? Do you think, no thanks to the July riot and violence and looting and all of that, with a whole dozens of billions of rand still being counted in terms of the consequences or the impact on that on some of the major banks and chain stores that were badly affected, including the property that were destroyed?
Yes, and I think the business confidence is a bit of a conundrum. If you cannot put this in a box, because you've got sectors that are actually doing very well, where confidence is quite high, like in agriculture, for instance. And if you took a snapshot, a static picture of what in business confidence looks like overall in South Africa right now, it doesn't look. It looks quite bleak. But the outlook is in fact improving quite a bit, especially in sectors that have been hit very hard by the COVID lockdown, like the tourism sector. There is an anticipation that that's going to start opening up, especially with increasing vaccination rates around the world. And with that, in a sense, business confidence is that conundrum where the current position is actually quite bleak. The outlook is actually quite positive, because I think people are looking forward to that recovery. The IMF's upgrade of the economic growth outlook, I think, is indicative of that. is that we've experienced slow growth up until now, but I think that growth rate is going to pick up as we go forward, and we probably will end the year on a modestly, and I stress modestly, positive note on the question of business confidence as we gear up and we recover from those riots, from the and also from the COVID lockdown measures. We've still got a long way to go, but I think we will be on a modest upward trajectory, by the end of the year.
Yeah, just stepping into my final question, Chris, in terms of tell us how the level 1 reopening is going on right now. Our business is fully reopened, black-owned businesses, as it were, those who are mainly involved in creating jobs and employment in South Africa. Is he holding on very well? How are we progressing on the side of the vaccinations in terms of the number of folks being tested, folks getting back to work because they've been fully vaccinated or they've had some measure of protection that they can get them back to work?
Yeah, vaccination certainly started with a bang, and it's a bit of a whimper at the moment. I think there's still a bit of skepticism as to whether one should get a vaccination or not. So the vaccination centres are not busy at the moment, even though there's a long way to go to go towards full vaccination. But I think most people are tired of the lockdown measures in any case, and want to actually put it behind and carry on. And I think certainly a pragmatic policy decision to take is to really transfer the responsibility of protecting or taking measures to protect individuals as individuals see fit to protect themselves, rather than to have these blanket impositions, which is not really helpful. We really do need to open the economy up. We cannot afford another lost tourism season at the end of this year either.
Great to have you on the show tonight. Thank you so much, Chris Hart, Executive Chairman, Impact Investment Africa in Cape Town. Enjoy the rest of the evening and your weekend.